I'm going to look this week to be the start of our little series that we're going to do for the next couple of weeks on evangelism and, church growth. We'll start here with two narratives, I'll call them. One of them we've looked at a little bit before when we've dealt with evangelism, but we'll look at it from a different perspective this morning with the woman at the well in John chapter 7. And then we're going to turn over to chapter 6 in feeding the 5,000. But to set the scene here a little bit of Jesus being the water, Jesus being the bread, stop and think about the last time you really felt thirsty or hungry. I remember when I was a kid, we would stop at the Jiffy store on the way home from Wednesday night worship, and my mom would get a gallon of milk. We'd get home, and it wasn't that we were completely out of milk, but we just needed more. And so we had some in the refrigerator that was still good, nothing wrong with it. I don't know what it was, but I just remember saying that, before bed, could I get a drink of milk? Yeah, and so she'd get the milk jug out that had been in there and say, oh no, can I get some new milk? I was very picky, I guess. It wasn't that milk was particularly, much newer. So we went through a lot of milk when I was a kid. I think my kid probably drank more than we did. But sometimes we feel like we're thirsty or hungry, and when we're offered something to satisfy us, it's, well, I don't want that. Well, then you must not be very thirsty. You must not be very hungry. Can I have something to eat, Mom? Yeah, here's an apple. I don't want an apple. I want some cookies. That's what I'm hungry for. So it's not really that we're really all that hungry, but rather we want something good to eat. We want something to fill our bellies. Jesus says in Matthew chapter 5, verse 6, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled." That's the kind of hunger and thirst that we're going to be talking about. That's the kind of hunger and thirst that Jesus came to satisfy. There's some statistics that I'm not going to give you the exact numbers because depending on what source I use, it varies a little bit, but between 3,000 and 6,000 children every day die of malnutrition or malnutrition-related illnesses worldwide. It's a lot. That's a big number. And really what it gets down to is they don't have access to clean drinking water. If you cook with the water that the cow was just standing in and drinking and doing other things in, as well as you, and then you go back and you drink that water and you use it to cook, you're going to get sick. Well, you get a tummy ache. The doctor recommends that you hydrate. Well, you're hydrating with the same water that made you sick. And so worldwide, that number's come down a bit since I first read about these statistics back in college, but it's still a staggering number of kids that are basically just dying because they can't have access to clean water. 2,000 to 6,000. We live in a world full of people who are hungry just for that basic necessity of life. Jesus is here in John chapter 4 confronting this woman. Not really a confrontation, but he happens upon her. They're traveling and they come across this well that had been a well there for a long time. Abraham, this was where they would go when they would get water. And there's this woman there that we've, like I said, talked about before. We're not going to really focus so much on her, but focus more on what Jesus says to her. Because he was thirsty. He said, "Can you give me something to drink?" What do you mean, give me something to drink? How is it, verse 9, that you being a Jew ask a drink from me, a Samaritan woman? For Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. Jesus said to her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is who says to you, 'Give me a drink,' you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." This kind of piqued this woman's interest. She's kind of thrown and taken aback a little bit. "What are you talking to me for? I'm a woman and a Samaritan. You Jews don't really like us, and you don't really talk to women. So well, what are you doing? And he redirects. Well, if you knew who you were talking to, you would have asked for something that only I could give you, this living water. Well, this definitely piques her interest. What do you mean, this living water? This well is deep, she says in verse 11. Sir, you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. Where then do you get that living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us this well and drank from it himself, as well as his sons and his livestock? And Jesus says, just like we know, if you drink water, you're going to get thirsty again at some point. So yeah, this water has been in this well for a long time. But you have to come here every day. And that was kind of the wife's job, or the woman's job in this time, was to go down and get water for the day. So they're carrying water back and forth, and that amount of water that you would need for a day is pretty heavy stuff. So every day she's having to go and get water. Every day you're going to get thirsty. Doesn't matter how much you drink the day before, you're going to wake up and you're going to be thirsty again. And so this piques her interest. What do you mean? Whoever drinks from this is going to thirst again, he says. But verse 14, but whoever drinks of the water that I shall give will never thirst. But the water I shall give him will become in him a fountain of water springing up into everlasting life. I'll tell you that, hey, I've got something that you can drink that you'll never be thirsty again. You'll never hunger again. The hunger one, I don't know. There's too much pleasure in eating that I'd want to give up that kind of thing for the rest of my life. David, never being thirsty again? Sure, that sounds pretty sweet. Let's have some of that. Almost like the fountain of youth. You're never going to get sick again. You're never going to get old again. You mean I don't have to come and carry water anymore? I'll take some of that. Give me some of this water, she says in verse 15, that I may not thirst nor have to come here and draw. So he enters into this conversation in a corrective way, or here's your life, here's where you're standing, as it is in relationship with God. Go call your husband. I don't have a husband. You're right. You're living with a guy that's not your husband. You've had 5 others before. There's a problem here. And she tries to change the subject again. Our fathers, in verse 20, worshipped on this mountain, and you Jews say that in Jerusalem is the place where you ought to worship. And Jesus says, though, that there's coming a time when you're going to worship in spirit and truth. That's who God wants to worship him. In verse 24, God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. The woman says in verse 25, well, I know that the Messiah is coming, who's called Christ. When he comes, he will tell us all things. I am he. In verse 26. So his disciples come back. And Jesus has offered this woman something that nobody else can offer. This living water. This water that you're never going to thirst again. And he's not talking about a physical thirst. He's talking about a spiritual need that is going to be satisfied. Just like the spiritual hunger and the spiritual thirst for righteousness that he talks about in the Sermon on the Mount is going to be satisfied. He's offering her satisfaction for righteousness. And she accepts. She goes away. She left her water pot there, went into the city, and said to the men, come and see a man who told me all things that I ever did. Could this be the Christ? These are the kind of people that we're looking for. This woman was clearly thirsting and hungering for righteousness. She was looking for the Messiah. Verse 34, Jesus says, after his disciples question him, hey, aren't you hungry? Aren't you thirsty? He says, no, in verse 32, I've got food that you don't know about. In verse 35, he responds to them. Verse 34, rather, my food is to do the will of him who sent me and to finish his work. Do you not say there are still 4 months and then comes the harvest? Behold, I say to you, lift up your eyes and look at the fields, for they are already white for harvest. And then skipping down to verse 39, many of the Samaritans of that city believed in him because of the word of the Samaritan who testified, he told me all that I ever did. We're going to look next week at a man named Apollos. The one that watered. Paul planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase. Jesus went there and he told her of the gospel message. The righteousness that could be hers. And what was her response was to go and tell everybody in town. I would imagine that she did not have the greatest reputation in town. If she had been living with someone who wasn't her husband and she's had 5 other husbands besides this, everybody in town would have known that kind of a thing about her. But she went and she spread the truth about Jesus. Hey, could this be Jesus? And look, many of the Samaritans of that city believed in him because of her word. Because Jesus offered her living water, and she accepted it. We have access to that living water that we can give the lost of the world. Turn now with me to John chapter 6. And this is another one of those kind of Bible class stories that we learn about Jesus feeding the 5,000. There's a couple of times that this happened. It's repeated in the Gospels. But we see here that they're there, and it was close to the Passover feast of the Jews. And so he looks up, Jesus in verse 5 looks up, and he sees a whole lot of people coming towards him. And he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread that they may eat?" But he said this to test him, for he knew himself what he would do. Where are we going to get enough food, Philip? This is Jesus saying this, and he already knows what he's going to do. I like somebody that does that. That's the kind of, I do that in class every day. Ask a question. I know the answer. It's not that I need my students to tell me the answer. And we see, well, I mean, 200 denarii worth of bread is not enough to feed them. Just enough for everybody just to have a little bit. And then we see Andrew come and he says, hey, there's a kid here that's got some bread and some fish. Two small fish and some bread. But really, I mean, what is that compared to all this? Verse 10, Jesus said, make him sit down. And he took the loaves and he gave thanks and he distributed it to the disciples, and the disciples to those sitting down, and likewise to the fish as much as they wanted. That's a little tidbit right there in that passage. Jesus blessed it, and then he gave it to the disciples, and then the disciples distributed it. We're going to see here in the latter part of this chapter that Jesus is the bread of life. In fact, Brother Robert read for us this morning the last part of this passage. That Jesus is the flesh that we need to eat and the blood that we need to drink. The same scene is going on here. The next day is when that happens. Jesus is the bread. The apostles were the distributors. Just like we talked about last week, blessed or how beautiful are the feet of those who preach the gospel. But how are they going to know unless somebody tells them about it? We're the ones distributing the bread now. We're the ones distributing just this little bit of bread, this little bit of fish, right? That after they're all done, after just this little kid has this little bit, and he's offering it to all these people. And Jesus takes and multiplies it enough to feed at least 5,000 people. And after they're done, they collect up enough after everybody's eaten as much as they want. He sends his disciples out and they collect the excess, the leftover, and fill 12 baskets. Just point out a little bit, there's 12 tribes of Israel. And Revelation 12 is also it's an important number. That there's going to be enough of the bread of life to go around to everyone. It's not just going to be for the few, but it's going to be for everybody. And this is kind of a common theme, especially in John, where it's not just a sign for the sign's sake, but it's a sign to show a message. That was the point of Jesus performing miracles in the first place. We see this with the wedding feast, and he turns water into wine. And there was plenty for everyone. We had some wine this morning, representative of Jesus' blood. Jesus' blood is sufficient. There's enough of the bread of life to go around. There's going to be plenty for all and more than we can use. Jesus tells them, gather it up so that nothing is lost. And at the end there of this scene in verse 14, the people that saw this, truly, this is the prophet who is to come into the world. It was not a question like the woman at the well. Is this the Christ? Is this the Messiah that's supposed to come? It was a statement. This is the prophet that is to come. Jesus departs. He walks on the sea that night. The next day, starting around verse 22 and following, some others were looking for him. They came back. Those who had eaten the bread came back. They're looking for Jesus. And they find him, and they ask this question, Rabbi, when did you come here? We didn't know that you left. We saw your friends leave, but we didn't see you get in the boat with them. Well, it's because he walked out to them on the water. But Jesus says here, verse 26, just like he kind of asks the question of Philip, hey, where are we going to get all the food for these people? What are we going to do to test Philip? Jesus tells these guys, he's answering the question they didn't ask. Most assuredly, this verse 26, I say to you, you seek me not because you saw the signs, but because you ate the loaves and were filled. Well, this isn't a lesson on benevolence. This is an important passage in dealing with people who are physically in need. Because those who were there, who came to Jesus, they had a physical need. They had to eat. And there wasn't any place for them to go to buy enough food. And so Jesus provided for them. But it wasn't that they looked for him the next day because they heard the message or they saw the sign that Jesus is the bread of life. But they were looking for him now because he fed them. You ever met anybody like that? You ever met somebody who has come seeking Jesus and all they're really asking for is the physical bread to satisfy their physical need? We're going to run across people like that in our search to spread the gospel. And Jesus says here, don't labor for the food that's going to perish, but for the food which endures to everlasting life, which the Son of Man will give you, because God the Father has set a seal on them. And they want to know what they can do to work the works of God. But Jesus, skipping down to about verse 32, most assuredly I say to you, Moses did not give you the bread from heaven, but my Father gives you true bread from heaven. Because Moses, while they were in the wilderness, they would eat the manna in the morning. They'd gather enough, and then the next day they'd have to do it all over again. I mean, we know that. We got to do that every day. We got to drink water every day. We got to eat stuff every day. But Jesus says, I'm not talking about manna that's going to come from heaven that you're going to eat physically and be full. He says, for the bread of God is he who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. They want this bread. In verse 34, give us this bread always. And Jesus said to them, I am the bread of life. He who comes to me shall never hunger, and he who believes in me shall never thirst. Jesus feeds the crowd, and these guys want more of the physical bread. But they kind of miss the point until he explains it to them. Again, we go back to that woman at the well. We go back to Jesus distributing the bread and the fish to the disciples, and then they go and take it. It's going to take someone to bring the gospel to the lost. It's not going to happen on its own. It's not going to happen with a fancy saying on a marquee. It's not going to happen with a clever post on social media or a video of a sermon online, but it's going to take someone sitting down and bringing the bread of life and the water of life and teaching the lost. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 1 through 9. Now this is the commandment, and these are the statutes and judgments which the Lord your God has commanded to teach you, that you may observe them in the land which you are crossing over to possess, that you may fear the Lord your God, to keep all His statutes and His commandments which I command you, you and your son and your grandson, all the days of your life, that your days may be prolonged. Therefore, hear, O Israel, the Lord, and be careful to observe it, and may be well with you. And you may be multiplied greatly as the Lord God of your fathers has promised you, a land flowing with milk and honey. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, and with all of your strength. And these words which I command to you today shall be in your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit at your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise up. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be a frontlet between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. Can't wait for some big event to happen. We can't wait for a special invitation for you to go out into the lost and preach the gospel. It's got to be as you go into all the world, as you go to the grocery store, as you go and talk with your neighbor, as you share a meal with a friend that's not a Christian. That's when we share the bread of heaven. That's when we share the bread of life. That's when we share the water, the living water. See, Jesus was just on his way. Both of these times, he was just on his way somewhere. And he happened across people who were seeking. The woman at the well, she didn't express herself that she was seeking the Messiah. And it may not even have been until he started talking to her about these things that she really even fully comprehended that she was seeking him to begin with. We see those 5,000 men at least coming, looking for Jesus. It may be that they were just simply looking for a show. Jesus, at this point, they were looking for him because people knew who he was. And they showed up and they were fed. The next day, that's certainly what they were looking for. They claimed otherwise. They claimed, hey, how'd you get over here? We didn't see you leave last night. But Jesus cut to the heart and said, no, you're looking for more food. If you had really comprehended what was going on, you would have understood what you were given yesterday. You would understand what you have access to, the bread of life. If you were walking by and you saw somebody legitimately starving to death, legitimately about to die because they could not get a clean drink of water. They estimate that it really wouldn't cost all that much money to get clean drinking water for the world. We've got the technology, solar power, but also other kinds of pumps that'll pump stuff out of the ground that requires little to no electricity. It really wouldn't cost all that much money. If you could, wouldn't you give it to him? We see the rich man after he's passed away and he's there in torment, and Lazarus is up there in Abraham's bosom. And the rich man is calling out. He just wants just a drop of water on his tongue. Can Lazarus just dip his finger in some water and just drop it on the tip of my tongue? I'm so thirsty. At that point in time, it was too late for the rich man. And he's told, you can't go back and tell your family. They have the prophets. They have the law of Moses. They know. We can't wait till it's too late. We can't wait until the world starves to death. We can't wait until the world dehydrates to the point where there's no options anymore for them. That day's coming. We have the bread. We have the water. Are you hoarding it? Or are you going into all the world and preaching the gospel? Jesus asks, where are we going to get enough bread? Where are we going to get enough to feed them? Is your response, well, we don't have enough. We don't have enough money. We don't have the facilities. We don't have enough songbooks. We don't have... Fill in the blank. That was Philip's response. I like Andrew's response. It was a little better. Hey, we've got some bread. We've got a little kid here. But really, that's not going to do enough. I've just got my little Bible. Is that really going to be enough? Jesus made it enough. Because it's not you planting, and it's not the next guy watering, but it's God who gives the increase. We've got the bread and the water. Don't hoard it. Give it to the starving, dying world, and God will give the increase. Gospel invitation is open. The water is ready, and if it's not, we can make it ready. You can have your sins washed away, and you can drink from that living well that won't go dry. Won't you come as we stand?